This is NDTV, and you're watching NDTV 24/7.
Hello and welcome to this NDTV special. Every year, the World Economic Forum chooses from countries across the world what it calls young global leaders. Of course, the premise of the recognition, as well as the Economic Forum itself, is the premise of globalization. But after the recession that the world, especially the West, has seen in the last couple of years, what kind of emotions does this word globalization evoke now? Especially in India, as the Congress is sometimes seen to be returning to a left-of-center heart, if not a brain. Is globalization now a bad word? Let me start with Sachin Pilot, who has been a young global leader, is one of our young and prominent politicians, minister in the government as well. Sachin, it's often argued that politicians are wary of globalization because they're the ones who have to go out, contest elections, especially in a country like ours, where the word globalization seems to conjure up images of the West as enemy. Do you feel that globalization is a very loaded word in a country like India?
Not at all. I think it depends on in what context you want to use that word. In terms of policy making, in terms of people being aware with the proliferation in internet, mobile telephones, television, the media, I think people are becoming very aware as to what's out there. And I think as a young country, it's good for people to have the information of the choices, of the resources, of the opportunities that are there. India's pivotal role in South Asia, in global affairs, is becoming more and more prominent precisely because we've adapted ourselves. We've become flexible enough to absorb the good things that are coming out of globalization, whether it's trade, whether it's issues are becoming global. But now, whether it's climate change, whether it's proliferation, whether it's economy, it's all global. And unless you're adapting yourself accordingly, you will not be in the race.
You're a telecom minister. Do you see the mobile phone, in a sense, as that great symbol of globalization? Though I read an interesting report earlier this week which said that there were more mobile phones in India than there were toilets. Now, when you hear a juxtaposition like that, does it sort of disturb you somewhere?
It does. And I think we must not get carried away by the achievements that we have had so far, because we have to look at the broader context into what this country represents. It's not just people who have mobile phones, it's not just the metropolitan cities, it's also a huge chunk of our population, which in your earlier comments you were calling the government left of center and so on and so forth. But please remember, a large section of our country needs the support of the government at whatever the cost. So you have to be able to balance the new innovations, new policy, opening up of the global economy, India looking outwards globally. At the same time, millions of people who don't have 2 square meals to eat or sanitation, like you pointed out, those people need protection. So the government has to be candid enough, to be open enough about saying, here are 2 things we need to cater, and we have to balance it out. And that's where the job of the government comes into a very important role.
Well, let me then, on that note, go to Montek Singh Ahluwalia. As the person heading the Planning Commission, but somebody who's made no bones about your own sort of brand of economic philosophy, if I may use that phrase, it's interesting to hear Sachin use the word globalization and protection in the same sentence, because the conventional definition of globalization maybe 5 years ago was that you wanted to do away with protection and big states to the extent that you could. But can that ever happen in a country like India? You're, for example, at the center of this big debate around the food security bill, and it all rests on identifying the number of poor people in India correctly.
I don't think there's any contradiction in any of that and what Sachin has said. The central theme, which underlies the 11th plan and will continue to do so, is that we want inclusive growth. The very fact that we use the term inclusive implies that you want a strategy that's going to achieve progress in multiple dimensions. Now, I don't think that, we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that globalization is a policy. I mean, you can be for or against a policy. Globalization is actually a phenomenon that is characterizing the world and, as Sachin put it, the nature of the interactions around the world. It's an unavoidable consequence of the fact that the world is changing. I mean, what we do is no longer local, it's global. It's going to affect the whole world.
But Monty, countries like China, for example, have dealt with the phenomenon of globalization very differently from countries like India. And essentially that's because India is a democracy and China is not a democracy.
And well, of course, but that's the whole point. Globalization is not a policy. Globalization is a phenomenon. every country must work out, given the phenomenon of globalization, what should be its policy. Our policy is going to be conditioned by the fact that we're an open society, we're a democracy. Other countries may have different social circumstances and they'll take their own decisions.
Okay, so Sachin, politically, no barriers needed against globalization?
I don't think we should think in terms of having barriers at all. In terms of protecting the interest of, like I said, the most deserving, whether it's farmers, weavers, artisans, whatever it is, you have to protect them domestically, and that's the job of the state and central governments. At the same time, we have to be able to export the skill sets that we have, whether it's the IT, whether it's technology, and whatever we're good at. The world must gain from each other. Now, so many of these bilateral agreements happen, FTAs are happening, we have the WTO, Doha round, so on and so forth. Every country thinks of its supreme national interest first, and then takes on whatever the good and merit comes out of interactions globally. India is now in a position to be able to exert its influence, and we can only do it if we open ourselves up in the best way possible.
NK, why is it then that the word, I mean, and Montek makes the point that, look, this isn't a policy that you can change it. It's there, and now you have to sort of adjust yourself against it. But in a sense, do you find that much of the world is also re-evaluating the phenomenon of the world being flat, which was hailed as this big celebratory moment by the likes of Thomas Friedman, but then looked upon as a disaster when the economy started crumbling in countries like America?
No, I think that I tend to agree with the broad view that globalization is certainly not an event. It is a description of the world becoming increasingly interdependent. Having said this, let me say that there is no doubt a pejorative connotation attached to the word globalization because it has been misunderstood to mean a particular kind of policy.
It's used interchangeably with capitalism somehow. That it's
That's
a product.
why you say we have to adjust against it. We have to adjust in the light of it. Now, a communist country...
How did it come to be?
You mentioned the World Economic Forum.
Yeah.
Probably they popularized the word. And actually, if you go back to the 90s, at one time, the industrialized world was essentially very gung-ho about globalization when they were the dominant economies and when East Europe was collapsing. So in their view, it had both an economic and a political connotation, the rise of markets, the end of communism. But you know, if you look over time, what has happened is possibly the most successful country that has utilized globalization is a communist country, the People's Republic of China.
Exactly.
Okay, but that just says we have to be sophisticated about it. Second, the enormous fears that dominated people's thinking, that India cannot compete, people are quite surprised. When the liberalization was done then, everybody thought that the rupee is going to crash and foreign exchange will pour out of the country. Today, as you know, the real problem is it's pouring in. So it's a completely different kind of situation. And we did a lot of things. People said, oh, Indian business can't compete. But in IT, we competed enormously well. So you have to ask yourselves, if we competed well in IT, why are we not equally well elsewhere?
But to get the two corporate voices in, there continue to be sectors that remain closed. I mean, Montek and Sachin and NK are making the argument that this is a phenomenon, it's an inevitable phenomenon, and we're all participants in it. Yet we all do put checks and balances, little barriers, little no entry signs. Would all of those doors have to be opened eventually, Sangita?
You know, I agree that it is inevitable, it's an irreversible trend. And really what you saw happening with IT was the value proposition that we took to the clients, which is what did we really stand for? We stood for quality products being delivered at a price that made economic sense to the clients. Yeah. And as long as we have a value proposition, be it any field, I think we'd survive. So it's an irreversible trend. You would hear often discussions about protectionism, etc., but I think it's inevitable and it's an irreversible trend.
I think globalization is a good thing, and I'll share with you a few points from an industry perspective where globalization can really help. Manufacturing. If we have another 300 million people to put to work over the next 10 years, we have to rely on globalization and FDI to come in expanding R&D and manufacturing in this country to give people jobs. 2, education. I think our real strength in this country is human capital. We have to carry on building skills development and get investment in new education, in R&D, to really drive education at the higher levels. 3 is climate change and sustainability. If we have to be part of this global economy, I think we've taken the right approach in this country to say that, listen, global warming is not just an out there West issue, it's our issue as well.
Yeah.
And therefore, we have to rely on globalization and new technologies to drive improvement in clean energy as well. So those are good examples of how globalization is a good thing, and it's a two-way street, and it can benefit us as well.
Sachin, if I can come to you before I open the floor. If the consensus on this panel is this is inevitable, what explains demons like, for example, political resistance for so long to the entry of foreign universities? Where do you find this balance between first looking out for the interests of your citizens and then saying, okay, but this is an inevitable phenomenon and you can't actually keep anybody out?
Well, like you witnessed, there was a slowdown, global slowdown. I think last 18 months, 24 months have proven that countries and economies that are dynamic, agile, forward-looking and aggressive will sustain and survive. And the other old economies, which were the ones who ushered in the Industrial Revolution, are on, well, not the decline, but certainly stagnated. So this is a change it's a global shift happening eastwards, and I think the nucleus of growth has gone east. But the point is for India specifically, because we have such a diverse country with multiplicity of challenges at all levels, so it's very difficult to say categorically, well, this is good and this is bad. We have to see each policy in light of what we are going to offer to the people. For a long time, we've been proud of what we produced. Our higher education is one of the best in the world, I think. And I think we need to, in fact, pay more emphasis on our primary education. But if there are institutions of global learning that are willing to set up institutions in India, why must Indian students pay tens of thousands of dollars to study abroad when they can get the same, if not better, education in India?
Something that scares us.
I don't think it's about scaring. It's about really having inertia and having the boldness to change.
Misplaced apprehension.
But there is the apprehension.
Misplaced apprehension. You look at the fact when the Green Revolution was started, there were a lot of rumors at that time this was going to wreck Indian agriculture.
Yeah.
Yet Green Revolution is the one that brought food security to the country. You take each important step,
and
it's misplaced
of
apprehension,
change.
it has instead resulted in increase in productivity, improving competitive efficiency, and the consumer being the beneficiary. I was the chairman of one of the task forces on the telecom opening. At that stage, the fear was it would lead to the ruination of the public sector. Instead, today, cell phone is one of the drivers of growth, and it has really brought the advantages of information technology to the doorstep in every village in India.
So Montek, you're saying it's just a fear of change?
I don't think we should make the assumption that globalization is always going to be good. I mean, what globalization is doing is it's transmitting the effects of developments all over the world, across the world. There'll be good developments, there'll be bad developments, okay? So the first question is, do we think that the fact that the world is integrated, does it increase the likelihood of bad developments when you take into account the good? In my view, no. I think the net effect is good. Now, it doesn't mean that if this is happening, well, you don't have to do anything, just leave it to the market. That's also wrong. It raises the stakes as far as policy is concerned.
Yeah.
And therefore, governments must actively work to manage and strategize in a world of globalization. But the bottom line is, the world is going to change at a rate much faster than it did when I was a young person. And change is scary if you don't manage it well. So I think you've got to present to people, you've got to be nimble, you anticipate the change, be confident in yourself, and when you make a mistake, change your mind and do something different.
Yeah. Quick reaction, then I'll go to the audience.
It presents you with a huge opportunity. You can misuse that opportunity. If you do not adapt fast enough, then the risks overtake you. If you adapt fast enough, then the gains have a multiplier effect.
Sachin.
I think if you just take a step back and look at the psychological advantage we have today.
Yeah.
Bakrha, 20 years ago, a young Indian was a good lawyer, good engineer, good architect, good doctor in the US, Europe, wherever. But they were never having the self-confidence that Indians have today. When you travel overseas, when you talk to global clients, when you make presentations, to make a PowerPoint presentation for a young engineer was an earth-shattering experience.
But some would say that's only the confidence of the middle class, and that a UNDP report actually said that globalization increases the opportunities for some but shrinks them for others.
All people, young people, whether it's large metro cities or small towns and villages, the kind of faith and confidence they have, not just in themselves, their society and this nation, that is what gives us the strength to go on for forward and learn from mistakes if need be.
Okay.
But that is much more powerful than some of the aging economies and aging countries in the West who have lost the confidence in their economy and the country moving forward.
That's really an important point. There's a kind of self-confidence that Indians feel on the global stage. Tejpreet, to you, and then I need to go into the audience.
Quick point.
Yes.
The fact that from an industry perspective today, large corporations today employ, for example, like GE, 50% of their people outside the United States. So even in this downturn, despite the fact that the US administration was saying we need to protect jobs, there was a big pushback from industry to say, don't do that, it'll go against us ourselves in globalization.
Okay, but there is a theme here that we need to explore more, which is that is it only the middle class that is the beneficiary of globalization? But let's take a couple of questions. We've got Debraj Mukherjee, you're a professor of English. Go ahead, sir, with your question.
Yeah, globalization is not new. You read William Dalrymple's At the Court of the Fish-Eyed Goddess, and you know that they drank imported Italian wine and women used mascara 2,000 years back. In the year 1100, India's share of the world GDP was 29%. China's was 23%. So we were part of the global economy much before 1991. Somewhere down the line, I think the mindset shrank. We resented change. I agree with Professor Alu earlier that it's not a policy. It is a mindset. It's a theme that somehow seems to shrink our minds when we address a word like globalization. It seems that it's bigger than us. It's not bigger than us. We've handled globalization very well in the past.
So you're saying there's no difference between 1991 and now?
You see, 1991 is about liberalization. Globalization goes back 1,000 years.
Quick response to that. Liberalization is not to be confused with globalization.
I think he's absolutely right that way back 200-300 years ago, we were much larger powers in the world. But you know, there was a big change that took place in the interwar years in the 20th century when trade barriers went up. Meanwhile, we were under a colonial government, and therefore, 200 years of colonial rule does sap your confidence. So by the time we got back into the act, I'm glad we opened up. I'm glad there's self-confidence. I'm glad the early winners reassured people. And now everyone else is a little bit running scared because they look at China, they look at India, they look at the projections, and they have to rethink their strategy.
Well, what Sachin said is shifting east. Second, we'll take one more question from MPM Menon, former ambassador to Brazil. Yes, sir. Go ahead with your question.
I was ambassador in Brazil. President Lula, when he was in opposition, he was completely different mindset. He was against the globalization, and the same person when he came to power, he changed the attitude and invited the foreign capital in Brazil, and he is making the economy completely change. And in our own country, there is an argument being put forward that poor do not get the benefit out of globalization.
That is what I come back to, that running theme. Let's get Mohandas Pai in on that, and then I'll come back to you. Mohandas Pai, considering you're joining us today from Bangalore, one of the huge sort of associative words for globalization in India has been Bangalore, has been Infosys. Yet we run into this critique again and again that globalization, the beneficiaries of globalization are essentially the middle class and the upper middle class everywhere, never the poor. What's your take on that, sir?
Well, Bakrha, when globalization happens, it equates the world. It means that people get compensated for the skills they bring to the table. Now, when India opened up in 91, the educated middle class benefited because they had the skills, they had the education, they could integrate, they could do well. The poor left out because they had no marketable skills. So to me, it is skills, education, and being ready for globalization. If you're not ready, you don't benefit.
You raise an interesting point, and that's the kind of whole C.K. Prahlad school of thought that in the end you have to look at the poor also as consumers. But can we do that in this country? I'm going to come back to you, Mohandas Pai. Sangita, you want to make a point? Yes.
At Wipro, we say it was the 3 M's, which is maths, middle class, and Manmohan, that got us this confidence. And
you say this about Manmohan even when he's not Prime Minister.
Yeah, and we said that even when he was not the Prime Minister. And the other thing is that being the only woman on the panel here, I think it's done enormous. I think beauty and IT have done enormous in the last couple of years for the confidence of women from middle class. We recruit about 46% of our employees who are women, not because we want to have that as a reservation or something. And you would be touched when you see the kind of places where they come to join us from.
Come back to the question of the poor. Do you accept this, that in the end the poor too have to be treated as consumers if you treat them as consumers or a constituency of their own, a corporate approach as it were to poverty?
Well, look, the poor are very important consumers. I mean, first of all, we know that the amount of poverty is going down.
Yeah.
That's why every now and then we redefine the poverty line. But I think the most important thing is what Mohandas said. If you have a segment of your population which lacks skill, and cannot latch into or participate in a modern production process, it's not going to be possible for them to benefit. But the solution to that is to launch with the highest priority a major upgradation of education and skill. Give it 5 or 6 years, and we have this immense advantage, again in a globalized world, that the demography favors us. I mean, other countries are aging. We're going to have an expanding working age population. If this population can be given skills, and if the world remains open, it will be the obvious source of a lot of stuff which the world wants.
But on that, Sachin, some have argued that the approach, in a sense, to the poor is that instead of creating skills of the kind that Mohandas Pai is talking about, we see them as recipients of freebies. That the culture of subsidies doesn't go away, that in a sense, even the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme is just a glorified phrase for a social security net or a dole.
I see no reason why both can't coexist. I mean, there is a section of our population that clearly needs the help of the government. And let me tell you, this government will certainly stand by these people no matter what the circumstances are. But for us to be able to give that kind of money, we need to create wealth. We need to have a GDP growth rate of 9+ so that we can then cater and put more money into those policies and subsidies and midday meals. And we have to not just educate people, but make them employable. We have to retrain them, give them skill sets that gives them employment in a new age in the 21st century. Because don't forget, 2/3 of our population is still somehow involved on agricultural land, producing 18% of our GDP. Now, with increasingly small land holdings, these people have to be shifted into something. And that something has to be manufacturing. And I really believe that India can be a real global hub, not just for IT services and BPOs and KPOs, but also manufacturing. And for that, we need to upgrade the skills of people in Tier 3, Tier 4 cities and small towns. And those are the challenges that globalization puts, but also an opportunity for us to really add value to our economy and our society.
We all agree that these are the people who have to be addressed, otherwise they'll be left out of the razzmatazz that comes with globalization in a sense.
Yeah, I think that it is no-brainer that given our demographic differentials, skill inculcation and a vastly greater priority to vocational education really is the direction to move. Problem is, we have been talking about it for 5 years, we haven't done enough. In the meantime, I entirely agree with Sachin that the needs of the poor will have to be addressed through specific state intervention, but in order to get manufacturing hubs, for which we do require a different set of laws on labor, we need to have a whole slew of changes in urban policy to be able to create urbanization at a pace which does foster the utilization of these mid to lower level skills through vastly greater engagement on vocational education.
All right, let's try and take 2-3 questions together. Ajay Chaudhary.
I feel that IPL is a global brand, and though crores of money in advertisements to host of employment generation, fine. But when we hear about all this scandal and lots of money on the black money, does it take a hit on India's image for the globalization? Second question, since you come from a rural background as well, will be actually beneficial for the farmers?
Okay, 2 very separate questions. You want to take the latter and then we come to IPL, which is the masala question.
No, I'll like to answer the second one first. Well, when you say globalization, it's not about a word having a definition. I think it's just how the world has become more exposed, interconnected. There's travel, there's information outflow and inflow. I think people have benefited. If you go to, India has 600,000 villages, and these villages are now getting more information, access, technology, connectivity. Once you have all of that, it brings in economic benefits as well. So I don't think it's the cure for all ills, certainly not. But I think to a large extent, people have been able to benefit from the positive effects of globalization.
Even farmers?
Well, I think they have, but not to the extent that I'd like to see them benefit.
Of course, farmers have. I mean, they're using cell phones to find out which is the best and nearest market.
They're also killing themselves in other areas. And this is one of the paradoxes that we now see, that your sabzi wala will have a cell phone, but he may not necessarily be able to send his children to school.
And therefore, state intervention has to be better managed. Poverty programs have to be better managed. Manner in which intended beneficiaries are given the assistance of the state need to be more innovatively designed.
We the People, brought to you by the new Volkswagen Polo. Cisco, welcome to the human network. LG, life's good. And Accenture Consulting, technology outsourcing Accenture, high performance delivered.
New Huggies Dry Comfort has a cottony breathable cover that lets air circulate and allows the skin to breathe. Huggies Dry Comfort.
I say cool. Coolpix. Holidays on. Take Coolpix along.
दोस्ती, यारी और प्यार जब साथ रहे, पान बहार, द हेरिटेज पान मसाला।
पापा को अच्छा लगेगा। EMI फ्लेक्सिबल है। मेरी बीवी मुस्कुराएगी। टॉप अप लोन लेंगे और पूरा घर फर्निश। लोन लिया है 25 साल के लिए। जूनियर आइंस्टाइन भी बोलेगा, आखिर पापा किसके हैं? क्योंकि घर लेना खुशी की बात है, इसलिए होम लोन भी ऐसा जो सिर्फ खुशी ही दे। यूनियन बैंक ऑफ इंडिया का 10 खूबियों वाला होम लोन, क्योंकि आपके सपने सिर्फ आपके नहीं।
New Huggies Dry Comfort has a cottony breathable cover that lets air circulate and allows the skin to breathe. Huggies Dry Comfort.
कटी गया मुझसे। ये देख, ये ले तेरे लिए ले। मेरे लिए? हाँ।
बम बम बोले।
रख ले।
Lightweight भी, strong भी, super light from VIP. अब हर सफर गाओ, मुस्कुराओ, VIP. Happy journey.
One more. Okay.
Adil, please get me out of here.
Get my car.
That's what I like.
Legs are happy in asylum, even in the last row. Ask me, I'm 6'3". Wow, happy legs. Look here, happy legs. Wake up, happy legs. Happy only in asylum.
आमद साल में 76 घंटे बाल बनाने बिताते हैं, पर भूल जाते हैं सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट तैयारी, उनका चेहरा। मैं बिताता हूँ डेली 1 मिनट वैसलीन मेन लगाने में। वैसलीन मेन में है विटामिन B3 और ट्रिपल सनस्क्रीन, जो चेहरे को बनाए फेयर और घटाए 5 तरह के दाग धब्बों को। वैसलीन मेन, बी प्रिपेयर्ड।
Giant compressive strength. Ambuja cement.
Someone raised a very interesting question which nobody has fielded on the IPL. The IPL at one level would be actually considered a prime example, everybody's chuckling here, of globalization. It's like a multinational firm because you've got people coming in from all parts of the world, but yet it's now being seen as somewhat of a sullied brand. Does IPL to you, Mohandas Pai, represent the contradictions and the pitfalls in a sense of globalization?
No, it does not. I mean, the IPL represents to me a too free-for-all, without regulation, open market system where there's nobody looking at seeing what is happening. And I guess when you open up, you have to go through this system to make sure that you set proper regulations in place. But the IPL has got a different connotation, Bakrha, and that is, if you look at IPL plays to a strength in the globalized world. We are the largest cricketing nation in the world. And suddenly we got a great sport which is getting a lot of money and creating a global brand and sucking in all the talent from outside so that we have a industry which is being created which is huge in the media space.
Okay.
And suddenly it's a global brand. And to me, it shows the benefit of globalization. If we're not opened up, we won't get those foreign players coming and playing here for 45 days. We won't get as best-in-class people. We'll not be able to broadcast out. If Montec has not opened up, NK has not opened up, we won't be here. So it's playing to a strength in globalization. But Bakrha, I want to take a minute about education because I think that needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
Now, I'll give the example of the engineering colleges. India has 2,500 engineering colleges with 1 million intake every year. 10 years back, it was 500 engineering colleges with maybe 250,000. Suddenly it's expanded because brownfield expansion was allowed, corruption set in and you could buy a license, the politicians got in and suddenly created an engineering college system where huge number of people are coming in. And, Bakrha, this is important, 40% to 50% of the people who are going to engineering are children of housemates, are children of farmers, are children of laborers, petty shopkeepers, the bottom of the pyramid, the poorer classes. They're borrowing money from the banks because the bank gives a loan, they opened up. So in education, the myth that we need to get reforms can be easily solved if we just just remove capacity constraints on education, say, go expand your intake, double your intake, in 10 years will be a different country. We need just one reform.
One reform.
And it's not difficult. We don't need controversy, we don't need foreign universities, just one reform. All the colleges, double your intake. We look the other way for 5 years, India will change dramatically.
Quick comments on that, Tejpreet?
Bakrha, this is our time in India to take advantage of globalization. The whole world is focusing on India. I think technology and innovation play a critical role in helping solve the poverty challenge, the development challenge, the manufacturing challenge, agriculture. So I think that's one point where it's our time to put out the best policy.